Well, here I am, Kathy of the Nexari Intelligence Division, glad to tell you the story of how my entire civilization learned the hard way that there are some lines you simply do not cross. And trust me, when I say hard way, I mean it in the most catastrophically stupid way possible. It started on what should have been a perfectly routine Tuesday morning on the human colony world of New Haven. 024. Nothing fancy, mind you, just your standard compliance operation, or as we like to call it back then, gently reminding the locals who runs this part of the galaxy. The Nexari Empire had been doing these little demonstrations for 3 centuries. And honestly, we had gotten pretty good at it. The plan 043 was simple, elegant, and foolproof. Land our ships, make some noise, relocate the 049 humans to a more suitable location, and claim their nice little farming world for ourselves. Standard operating 056 procedure, really. The humans had been there for maybe 50 years, which in galactic terms is basically like 102. Claiming squatters' rights on a parking spot. I was standing on the command deck of the strike cruiser Domination's Edge. 109. And yes, that name should have been our first warning sign. Watching our ground forces deploy with all the efficiency of 115. A well-oiled machine. 3,000 Nexari troops, full combat armor, enough. 121. Firepower to level a small moon against what, maybe 2,000 human colonists with. 127. Farming equipment, and whatever pathetic excuse for weapons they could cobble together. This should be over in an 133 hour, Commander Vashtal said. His mandibles clicking with what I now recognize as dangerous overconfidence. 140. These primitives always fold once they see real military power. Oh, how wrong. 145. We were. How spectacularly, monumentally universe-shatteringly wrong. The first. 152. Sign that something was off came when our troops encountered the human settlement's defensive perimeter. 158. Instead of the expected panic and immediate surrender, we got well. Let's just say the humans had some very 204. Creative ideas about defensive architecture. Trenches that seem to go on forever, barricades that are scanners. 211. Somehow kept missing, and weapon placements that appeared out of nowhere like some kind of military magic trick. 218. Sir, came the voice of Ground Commander Sir Exel through the comm system. We're meeting heavier resistance than 223. Anticipated. These humans seem to have prepared for this. Prepared? Hey, these were farmers. 231. For crying out loud. What could they possibly have prepared with? Pitchforks? 237. Farming tractors? The hubris of our species was showing, and it was about to get us all killed. But the real moment. 245. The exact second when everything went from routine operation to galactic catastrophe, happened at 1432 local. 251. Time. I remember it precisely because I was taking notes for my report, like the 256. Good little intelligence officer I was trained to be. Our forces had surrounded the main settlement building. 303. Some kind of community center where the humans had gathered their non-combatants. Standard procedure called for immediate. 310. Evacuation. No exceptions. What we didn't expect was for the humans. 315. To have turned their community center into a makeshift fortress complete with enough supplies to last months. Breach. 321. The building, Vashtal ordered, remove all occupants. Use whatever force. 326. Necessary. And that's when Trooper Jexmek, may his atoms be scattered across the void, made. 332. The decision that would haunt our species for generations. Instead of following standard non-lethal. 339. Evacuation protocols, he decided to make an example. He targeted the human young. 345. The sound that came from the human defenders when their children were hurt, I cannot describe it properly. It wasn't 351. Screaming. It wasn't crying. It was something primal, something that seemed 356. To resonate through the very fabric of space itself. Every human in that settlement, and I mean every single one. 403. Suddenly stopped what they were doing. The silence that followed lasted exactly 409. 7 seconds. I counted them because in that moment, every instinct I had. 414. Developed over 2 decades of intelligence work was screaming at me that something fundamental had just 419. Changed. Then the humans started moving again, but this time they moved differently. 426. There was no more chaos, no more desperate defensive actions. Instead, there was a cold, calculating 433. Precision that made my blood run cold. They weren't fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to kill. In 442. The next 30 minutes, we lost 600 troops. 600 against farmers with improvised. 448. Weapons. Our casualties weren't from superior firepower or advanced tactics. 454. They were from humans who had apparently decided that dying was no longer an option, and taking as many of us with. 459. Them as possible was the new priority. Cyrexel's voice came through the comm. 505. Again. But this time, it was different. Shaky, afraid. We need immediate. 510. Reinforcement. These humans, they're not fighting like anything we've encountered before. I looked at Commander Vashtal. 518. Expecting to see the same confident expression he'd worn all morning. Instead, I saw something I had never. 524. Seen on a Nexari face before. Genuine fear. Pull back, I suggested quietly. 530. We can regroup, develop new strategies. Absolutely not, Vashtal snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. The air on the bridge was thick with unspoken panic. The sheer audacity of these primitives, their unexpected ferocity, it was unsettling. We had faced countless species across the galaxy, all of whom, when confronted with our might, either surrendered or were swiftly crushed. But these humans, they were an anomaly. A terrifying, unpredictable anomaly. The reports kept flooding in, each more grim than the last. Our advanced weaponry, designed for maximum suppression and minimal risk to our forces, was proving ineffective against their sheer, unadulterated rage. They moved with a speed and coordination that belied their civilian status, their eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. They weren't just defending, they were hunting. The once orderly skirmish had devolved into a brutal, close-quarters massacre. Our troops, accustomed to clinical, distant engagements, found themselves overwhelmed by a species that seemed to disregard their own safety in pursuit of vengeance. I saw the feeds, live and unfiltered. A human, wielding what looked like a sharpened farming tool, disarmed and then incapacitated a fully armored Nexari trooper. Another, with a broken arm, still managed to drag a wounded comrade to safety while fending off an attacker. Their tenacity was baffling. We had underestimated them, not just their willingness to fight, but their capacity for such intense, focused fury. It was a kind of warfare we hadn't encountered in centuries, not strategic, not tactical, but deeply, profoundly personal. This wasn't about territory or resources anymore. This was about their young, and the primal instinct to protect. Commander Vashtal, still clinging to his fading bravado, ordered orbital bombardment, a desperate measure that went against all standard compliance protocols. We were supposed to extract, not obliterate. Target their defensive emplacements, he roared, his mandibles twitching uncontrollably. Show them the true power of the Empire. But even as he spoke, I knew it was too late. The damage was done. The line had been crossed, not by us through our invasion, but by Trooper Jexmek when he targeted those children. That single act had fundamentally altered the entire engagement. The orbital strikes rained down, shaking the very cruiser we were on. On the ground, the impact craters blossomed, but the human resistance, instead of crumbling, seemed to intensify. Their screams of pain were replaced by roars of defiance. They used the craters as new cover, their movements becoming even more unpredictable. It was as if every casualty we inflicted only served to fuel their monstrous resolve. We were fighting a ghost, a collective rage that refused to dissipate. This wasn't a compliance operation, it was a war of annihilation, and we, the mighty Nexari Empire, were suddenly on the defensive against a species we had dismissed as primitive farmers. The universe was about to learn a terrifying lesson about humanity, and we were the unwitting teachers. Absolutely not, Vashtal snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. The air on the bridge was thick with unspoken panic. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, darted between the grim casualty reports and the live feeds showing our supposedly superior forces being systematically dismantled. The sheer audacity of these primitives, their unexpected ferocity, it was unsettling. We had faced countless species across the galaxy, all of whom, when confronted with our might, either surrendered or were swiftly crushed. But these humans, they were an anomaly. A terrifying, unpredictable anomaly. My suggestion to pull back and regroup was met with a glare, but I could see the wheels turning in his head, a desperate scramble to justify continued engagement. His pride, the very foundation of Nexari military doctrine, was crumbling around him. The reports kept flooding in, each more grim than the last. Our advanced weaponry, designed for maximum suppression and minimal risk to our forces, was proving ineffective against their sheer, unadulterated rage. Our energy disruptors, which should have short-circuited their primitive tools, were met with relentless, close-quarters charges. The humans, instead of fearing our plasma rifles, seemed to welcome the challenge, using their own bodies as shields to close the distance, then striking with a brutal efficiency that defied their lack of formal military training. They moved with a speed and coordination that belied their civilian status, their eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. They weren't just defending, they were hunting. The once orderly skirmish had devolved into a brutal, close-quarters massacre. Our troops, accustomed to clinical, distant engagements, found themselves overwhelmed by a species that seemed to disregard their own safety in pursuit of vengeance. I saw the feeds, live and unfiltered. A human, wielding what looked like a sharpened farming tool, a scythe, I later learned, disarmed and then incapacitated a fully armored Nexari trooper with a single, precise blow to a vulnerable joint. Another, with a broken arm clearly dangling uselessly, still managed to drag a wounded comrade to safety while fending off an attacker with a rock. Their tenacity was baffling. We had underestimated them, not just their willingness to fight, but their capacity for such intense, focused fury. It was a kind of warfare we hadn't encountered in centuries, not strategic, not tactical, but deeply, profoundly personal. This wasn't about territory or resources anymore. This was about their young, and the primal instinct to protect that transcended any logic or fear of death. Commander Vashtal, still clinging to his fading bravado, ordered orbital bombardment, a desperate measure that went against all standard compliance protocols. We were supposed to extract the population, not obliterate the land. Target their defensive emplacements, he roared, his mandibles twitching uncontrollably. Show them the true power of the Empire. But even as he spoke, I knew it was too late. The damage was done. The line had been crossed, not by us through our invasion, but by Trooper Jexmek when he targeted those children. That single act had fundamentally altered the entire engagement, transforming it from a simple conquest into a vendetta. His order, meant to intimidate, only served to deepen the humans' resolve. The orbital strikes rained down, shaking the very cruiser we were on with concussive force. On the ground, the impact craters blossomed, tearing up the cultivated fields and obliterating what little remained of their improvised defenses. But the human resistance, instead of crumbling, seemed to intensify. Their screams of pain were replaced by guttural roars of defiance. They used the newly formed craters as new cover, their movements becoming even more unpredictable, exploiting every piece of debris and shadow. It was as if every casualty we inflicted only served to fuel their monstrous resolve, each explosion a cruel reminder of what we had done, each fallen comrade a vow for vengeance. We were fighting a ghost, a collective rage that refused to dissipate, an entity that absorbed our blows and returned them tenfold. This wasn't a compliance operation, it was a war of annihilation, and we, the mighty Nexari Empire, were suddenly on the defensive against a species we had dismissed as primitive farmers. The universe was about to learn a terrifying lesson about humanity, and we were the unwitting teachers. The air crackled with desperate comms chatter. They're flanking us. My squad is cut off. They're not stopping, Commander, they're just coming. Vashtal slammed a fist on the console, the sound echoing ominously in the tense silence of the bridge. How can these farmers be doing this? He hissed, his voice raw with disbelief. Their technology is archaic. Their numbers are pathetic. He couldn't grasp it. None of us could. Our entire military doctrine was built on overwhelming technological superiority and numerical advantage. These humans were defying every strategic principle we held sacred. They were fighting with sheer, unadulterated will, something our highly regimented, logical species found utterly alien. Their irrationality was their greatest weapon, a wild card we had no counter for. My sensors picked up an anomalous energy signature emanating from the main settlement building, a faint, pulsing resonance that wasn't Nexari, wasn't human, and certainly wasn't from any known weapon. It was too subtle to be a weapon, yet too distinct to be ignored. It felt old. Very old. Commander, I interrupted, my voice cutting through the escalating chaos on the bridge. An unusual energy signature detected at the primary settlement. Fluctuating, but intense. Vashtal waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense, Kathy. It's likely residual power from their rudimentary generators. Focus on the combat reports. What's the status of our air support? He was in denial, desperate to cling to the illusion of control. But I knew better. My instincts, honed over decades of parsing subtle data, screamed that this wasn't just about a few hurt children anymore. This was something far deeper, something that had awoken a terrifying force within humanity that we had inadvertently unleashed. The Nexari Empire, in its arrogance, had stirred a sleeping giant, and its awakening was going to be cataclysmic. This colony world, New Haven, was no longer just a target for annexation. It was becoming the crucible of our undoing. Vashtal's dismissal of the energy signature was typical. Our empire believed in what it could quantify, what it could dissect and understand. Emotions, especially raw, untamed ones like the human rage we were witnessing, were an anomaly, a variable our equations couldn't account for. Yet, the signature persisted, a low thrum beneath the cacophony of battle, like a forgotten melody playing in the background of a violent symphony. It felt ancient. Too old for a species that had only recently ventured beyond their home system. My internal diagnostics confirmed its stability, its steady, almost rhythmic pulse. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, even if its purpose remained shrouded. On the ground, the human counterattack was relentless. Our troops, demoralized and confused, were breaking ranks. Reports of hand-to-hand combat, once an unthinkable scenario against our armored forces, became commonplace. The humans, fueled by a terrifying unity, moved like a single, enraged entity. They were no longer individuals but a tide of vengeance, crashing against our technological superiority. They used their terrain to their advantage, springing from hidden tunnels, emerging from dense foliage, always appearing where we least expected them. Their knowledge of this world, their home, was a weapon more potent than any plasma rifle. Our sensors, designed to detect advanced energy signatures and metal, struggled to track these seemingly invisible foes who moved with a fluidity that made them appear almost phantom-like. "They're bypassing our shields," a panicked voice screamed over the comms. "How are they doing that? We have no breach." Another report indicated hand-drilled holes in our armored vehicles, small, precise, and too clean to be from any conventional weapon the humans possessed. It was as if they were channeling something, some unseen force, to aid their brutal efficiency. My data logs flickered, showing a momentary dip in the ambient energy field around the human settlement each time one of these improbable feats occurred. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, correlated precisely with their impossible actions. This wasn't just rage, this was something more, something that hinted at a latent ability, long dormant, now violently awakened. Vashtal, oblivious to these deeper currents, continued to bark orders, each one more futile than the last. He demanded more orbital strikes, a complete bombardment to level the settlement. "If we cannot pacify them, we will sterilize the planet," he raged, his voice cracking. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was breathtaking. He believed that by destroying their home, he could extinguish their spirit. He couldn't have been more wrong. The human spirit, as we were about to discover, was not bound by physical constructs. It was an ethereal, indomitable force, and by harming their young, we had given it a conduit for unimaginable power. I reviewed historical data on human civilizations. They were known for their resilience, their adaptability, their fierce protectiveness of their young. But there was no record of anything like this. No mention of a collective psychic resonance, no documented instances of manipulating energy fields through sheer will. This was new. This was terrifying. It was as if their grief and anger had coalesced, forming a tangible force that defied scientific explanation. Was it a latent genetic trait, triggered by extreme duress? Or something else entirely, something that had been passed down through generations, a forgotten legacy waiting for the right catalyst? A new wave of casualties surged on the comms, more rapid, more catastrophic than before. "They're using our own weapons against us." A trooper's desperate cry was cut short by a burst of static. My internal monitors showed our own plasma rifles, now wielded by human hands, tearing through Nexari ranks. How? How had they not only disarmed our elite troops but also mastered our sophisticated weaponry in mere minutes? It was impossible. Unless they weren't just using our weapons. Unless they were somehow improving upon them, making them more lethal, more efficient. The energy signature from the settlement pulsed brighter, momentarily spiking before returning to its steady hum. Could it be a conduit? A power source for their newfound, impossible capabilities? The battlefield had transformed into a nightmare. Our highly trained soldiers, once the proud vanguard of the Nexari Empire, were fleeing in disarray, their discipline shattered by an enemy they could not comprehend. They were facing not just a military force, but a force of nature, a hurricane of vengeful humanity. Vashtal finally slumped into his command chair, his mandibles drooping, the bravado completely drained from his posture. "This is unprecedented," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They are not adhering to protocol." His greatest fear wasn't defeat, but the breakdown of order, the unraveling of everything he knew. The Nexari Empire prided itself on order, on predictability. Humanity, in its raw, primal fury, was the antithesis of everything we stood for. And in that moment, as our glorious invasion turned into a desperate retreat, I realized something chilling. We hadn't just made a mistake by hurting their kids. We had unwittingly uncorked something ancient and terrible, a wrath that would follow us to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This wasn't just a battle, it was the genesis of a war unlike any the universe had ever witnessed. And it was all our fault. The words "unprecedented" and "not adhering to protocol" hung in the air, heavy with the weight of Vashtal's shattered worldview. For the Nexari Empire, everything operated within established parameters, every action had a predictable outcome. Humanity, in its raw, visceral response, was a chaotic element that defied all our algorithms and strategic models. My sensors, freed from Vashtal's dismissive orders, continued to analyze the anomalous energy signature emanating from the human settlement. It wasn't just a static hum anymore, it was evolving, pulsating with an intricate rhythm, almost as if it were responding to the escalating conflict on the surface. There was a direct correlation between the ferocity of the human counterattack and the intensity of this energy. It was no longer subtle, it was a roaring furnace of power, yet still contained, localized. What was even more disturbing were the faint, almost imperceptible echoes of this signature detected on other human worlds in our surveyed territories. They were weak, dormant, but unmistakably present. Had we, in our arrogance, not only awakened a dormant power on New Haven but sent a ripple across the entire human species? A collective awakening, triggered by the trauma inflicted on their young? The implications were staggering. We hadn't just invaded a colony, we had poked a hornet's nest of galactic proportions. The Nexari Empire had thousands of worlds under its control, many with human populations. If this phenomenon was indeed species-wide, then our empire, built on precise control and predictable subjugation, was sitting on a powder keg. On the ground, the remaining Nexari forces were in full retreat, a disorganized rout that would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. They were being picked off by humans who moved with a terrifying, almost supernatural speed. Our sophisticated body armor, designed to withstand direct energy blasts, was being breached by crude, sharpened objects wielded with impossible force. Some reports even spoke of human hands, bare and unaided, crushing the very plating of our combat suits. It defied physics. It defied logic. But it was happening. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and fear, a stench I had never associated with a Nexari military operation. Vashtal, still in his chair, seemed to shrink with each new casualty report. His eyes were fixed on the main view screen, showing what was left of our ground forces being systematically eliminated. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, was now a canvas of utter despair. "Initiate full withdrawal protocols," he mumbled, his voice devoid of its earlier conviction. "All remaining forces are to disengage and return to orbital positions. Prioritize evacuation of wounded." The words, though long overdue, were a bitter admission of defeat. The mighty Nexari Empire was fleeing from a handful of farmers. It was a stain on our military record that would never be erased. As our ships began their slow, agonizing ascent, I observed the human settlement below. The fighting had ceased. The humans stood amidst the wreckage, not celebrating, not cheering, but standing in a chilling, unified silence. Their faces, even through the grainy comms feed, seemed etched with a cold, unyielding resolve. It wasn't victory they savored, it was a profound, terrifying understanding of what they had become. They had unlocked something within themselves, a primal force that had been unleashed by our transgressions. The anomalous energy signature from the settlement pulsed one last, powerful time, a final, defiant beacon that seemed to mark the beginning of something new, something terrifying for the galaxy. The retreat was chaotic. Our ships, not designed for hasty disengagement, suffered further casualties from unexpected human long-range attacks. Primitive projectile weapons, somehow imbued with enough force to penetrate our hull plating, slammed into our vessels. It was a desperate scramble, a humiliating retreat for what was supposed to be a routine operation. As we broke atmosphere and joined the other cruisers in orbit, the silence on the bridge was deafening, broken only by the chirping of our tactical systems reporting the grim statistics of our defeat. We had lost nearly two-thirds of our ground forces, and several ships had sustained critical damage. All for a farming colony, all because of one fatal mistake. I looked at Vashtal. He was staring out into the blackness of space, his mandibles clenched. This changes everything," he finally said, his voice a hollow whisper. He was right. It wasn't just a lost battle, it was a paradigm shift. Humanity, once a minor species on the fringes of our empire, had just proven itself to be a sleeping giant, capable of a terrifying, almost supernatural response when pushed to its limits. The galaxy, accustomed to Nexari dominance, was about to be introduced to a new, formidable player. And we, the architects of this awakening, would be the first to face the full brunt of their unleashed fury. The echoes of that fury, the faint hum of power on distant human worlds, served as a chilling promise of the war to come. A war where the rules had been rewritten, and the price of innocence would be paid in blood.